You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 525, which is our course about mediation. Today we're going to focus in on stage 4, and this is where we talk about the notion of negotiation and problem solving. Now, this is a very important stage, and one that I think a lot of people think is mediation, even though it's just one part of mediation. So we're going to put it entirely in context and talk about a number of different topics today that are really around that idea of stage 4. So first, we'll talk about the stages of mediation. Second, we're going to talk about the goals that we use in stage 4. Next, we'll talk about some key tasks that mediators do in stage 4. And then we'll conclude the show by talking about some questions that have come up from some of my students and other practitioners as we talk about the notion of putting those skills into practice. So let's start by talking about the stages of mediation. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before is this notion that various practitioners will divide the mediation process up in different segments. And we have also acknowledged that it's not important to say whether there are 5 stages or 7 or 3. As long as you hit the main tasks, then it works. So as you know, I have 5 stages that I identify. So I want to talk about those 5 stages. One is the opening, and that is where we do the rapport building, we secure the agreement, we talk about confidentiality, and we make sure that the ground rules are covered. In stage 2, we talk about storytelling and identification. And this is where we really elaborate on what happened in the conflict, and depending on the context, we might elaborate greatly in order to help us identify the issues. In stage 3, we build the agenda. The mediator is careful to reflect on the main topics of interest on the part of the disputants. And as we build the agenda, then we're able to get into stage 4, which is our topic today, and that is to do problem solving and negotiation. And then finally, when we get that agreement established in stage 4, then we can move to stage 5 and write the agreement and then do our final testing of that agreement to make sure that it all works. So one of the main themes that I want to talk with you today about, and you'll hear this a few times throughout the show, is this notion that you really need to be clear about your role as a mediator. And I know I've talked about this topic before, but I want to remind you that when you know your role, then you know the behaviors that you need to engage in that moment, and you also understand the behaviors that you don't need to engage in. So I'll give you an example from my own life. As you know, I have a PhD in interpersonal communication, and I study and talk about conflict all day, every day for my work. And so one of the things that happens also in my life is that I play the role of mom. And so sometimes I think about knowing my role as being very important when I have those 2 different identities that are part of my everyday life. So I might be a mom sitting in the stands watching my son at a swim meet, and I notice that people are having a conflict. The question is it my role to be mom, like supporting the swimmer, or is my role to be the person to solve the conflict that's happening in the stadium chairs? Of course, that will depend on the context and maybe whether it relates to me as well. But if I am not sure what my role is, I might try to be mom and try to solve everyone's conflict in the world. I might try to do it at the grocery store and I might try to do it at the church. But the question that would be important to talk about is that productive? Is that a good thing to be doing in that moment, to be changing roles like that? So one of the really challenges I think that mediators have to really embrace is this notion that if you know your role, then you completely understand how you should be managing each stage in mediation. And so as we zero in on stage 4 today, this becomes very, very important because the notion that you might suggest your solutions or that you might advance what you think is the best idea is outside of the role that you're playing as a mediator. It doesn't mean they aren't good ideas, and it doesn't mean that they're not useful potentially, but they aren't owned by the outcomes are not owned by the disputants if you think them up. And so that is how we're going to think about this stage 4 as we get into it, and it's what's going to be on our mind as we travel through some of the elements of the stage 4 and kind of think about having that role clarification be our guide the entire way. So the first clip that I want you to look at is from the Mediator Resources Group. And they have some general ideas that are, in addition to some of mine, that some various things that they believe should happen in stage 4. Let's take a look.
Facilitating negotiations is where the real art of mediation comes in. The goal is to help the disputants clarify their feelings, identify their interests and needs, consider the impacts of their choices, and help them generate multiple possible solutions that may successfully address everyone's interests. A variety of mediator techniques can serve that end, including focusing the parties and clarifying their positions and proposals by asking open-ended questions and paraphrasing, reframing hostile or accusatory language, tracking and summarizing agreements, reality testing, and the use of silence.
So when we think about stage 4, one of the first elements for us to consider as mediators is to understand what are the goals in that stage 4. So it's negotiation and problem solving. And so as we identify the goals, we can think about what it is that we need to be achieving in that stage. When we think about the goals of stage 4, I have a few elements that I want us to consider. So one is to figure out the order of the issues. Now you might say, wait, I thought we were doing that in stage 3. It doesn't really matter because it is the transition from 3 to 4. So it doesn't really matter which stage you technically have it in, but this is where we identify the order, and I would suggest that if your disputants are agreeable, that you would follow the order that makes sense for them. Next would be to identify the options for settlement. And this is really something that I would add the terms without judgment. One of the elements that we struggle with as humans is this notion that we need to evaluate everything. And I would say suspending judgment here as you identify options for settlement is crucial. So you might hear an idea that seems to be a very bad idea, but it is their idea. And because it is their idea, it is worth writing down on the whiteboard or on the paper or wherever you're putting those ideas on a list. And so be aware of that. Next, we're going to help parties find a fair and realistic solution. And so we talk about fair, that's their version of fair, and also realistic, that it's been tested on some level in this stage for whether it will work or not. And this is not for you to judge that it won't work, so you wouldn't say, oh, that won't work. What else do you have in mind? Instead, you say, how will that work? Or are there parts of this that you don't believe will work? And then last, we're going to verify that all solutions are acceptable to both parties. So as we think about that, we're making sure that both parties are really agreeing to elements of the solution. And a lot of times in the negotiated agreements that I do, there are many parts to it. So we have to get agreement on each component part. And that's very important to think about as well. So as you will notice throughout this stage 4, there are many parts of stage 4 that are related to the ideas that we have already talked about in terms of negotiation. And some of you have a background in studying negotiation specifically. And when we talk about negotiation in that way, we want to identify that it's really principled negotiation that we're talking about. And that is this notion that we are going to be interest-based, that we're going to be cooperative, and that we've really given up this notion of competitive bargaining. In fact, we're going to actually look for win-win situations as many times as that is possible. So when we talk about the different important mediator tasks that are involved in principled negotiation, or this subcategory of stage 4, we would identify 4 things that mediator needs to do. One is to separate people from the problem. And this is something that people struggle with, but it's something that the mediator can facilitate or engineer so that there's clarity in the mediation session. Another is to focus on interests, not positions. And I know I've talked about that before. We're going to talk about that in this context as well. Invent options for mutual gain. And then also insist on objective criteria. And as we talk about this notion of doing all four of those things, you can see that the mediator, again, has a very busy list of things to do. And on some level, as I've talked already about the notion of clarifying your role, maybe that's sort of a gift. As a mediator, you have so many things on your mind that you need to accomplish that you can focus on those things as opposed to things that don't belong to the role that you're playing. Now, as we talk about those four ideas, I want to start with talking about separating people from the problem. And we're going to take a look at this first clip, which is Ariel Fox, and she's going to talk more specifically about this notion. Let's take a look.
How many people here have read or heard of the book Getting to Yes? Right, this book came out 30 years ago. It's widely accepted in many places in the world that win-win is a positive approach when possible for people on different sides to try to reach mutual agreement. So I had the great pleasure of being mentored by Roger Fisher, one of the authors of this book, and hearing a lot of his stories. One of them is that when this book first came out, actually Roger's son was very young. He was just learning to read. And Roger asked him what his favorite book was. So in sort of dutiful child-father relations, he pointed at this book. And his father, we were in Boston, so his father said, is it like Make Way for Ducklings, or and this can't really be your favorite book? And his son said, what could be better than a book called Getting Toys? So I guess sometimes it does work out with kids. That's not mine. But anyway, it's a very well-known book. I'm happy that so many of you have read it. It established a bunch of fundamental principles, and as many of you know, one of them was the idea that in negotiation, you should separate the people from the problem, right? So instead of you and I feeling that we're against each other because we have a conflict, there would be a way that we could step to each other's side, and the two of us together would face the problem out there. And Roger meant this even in situations in armed conflict, not just in simple household debate. He meant even when your armies are engaged in warfare, political leaders shouldn't approach as if they're against each other. They should, by side, focus on the problem together. And that's why this approach is often called joint problem solving, because that was his vision. So I spent a bunch of years traveling, teaching people in many different settings, these principles, including separate the people from the problem. But we often got the same question at the end of a workshop. And it was this one. What about if the people are the problem? And people would say, I think that's a very lovely idea, but actually my husband is my problem. I have a really difficult client, and my client is my problem. My colleague, my direct reports, right? There's a person in my life that I can't communicate with. We have broken trust. We don't have goodwill. I can't separate my problem from this person or this relationship because they feel too interconnected. Does anyone have an example that comes to mind? Right? You feel like, but this relationship and the dynamic, that's the problem I have. So at the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, I worked with colleagues for about 10 years to assemble what we thought was the best advice to give people when their experience was, the people are my problem. And this book, Difficult Conversations, came out about 10 years ago. And it tries to provide some good, clear behavioral advice when you feel the communication or the relationship is in your way and has to be addressed before you can do any kind of mutual problem solving. I would imagine some of you have read this book. There are also many other wonderful books in the area of communication and relationship. But as I mentioned, I spent a bunch of time working on this, and I share these stories with you because I just want to situate what we'll talk about today in the intellectual lineage that it's coming from. And so this is the context where my work comes in.
So as you can see from that clip, she gives us some very good vision into the original ideas behind principled negotiation and pulling out the problem so that individuals are able to solve that. When we try to lump people and problems together, we don't have that clarity that is needed in the mediation. Now, the next task that the mediator's got to have on his or her mind is this notion of focusing on interests, not positions. And we've talked about this previously, that it really shows up here, though, in stage 4 as being a very big enemy of problem solving, honestly. When people say, no, I'm only paying this amount, or I'm only doing this thing, or I'll never do that thing. And until you identify the interests, we really don't see that movement in terms of the agreement happening. And so you'll hear me talk about that notion again also in stage 5, where we're trying to get the agreement to happen, and people, when they get entrenched on positions, don't meet each other. And so the key is to identify interests and focus on that and get rid of those positions that really stop that progress. Let's take a look at this next clip that looks at interests and positions.
The scene is early 2000s. I've been invited to mediate between a major government in Southeast Asia and a group of, a guerrilla group that's been fighting in this country for 25 years, a war of secession. They want to secede. I'm meeting with the guerrilla leaders in Geneva, and we're talking, and the first question I have for them is, I understand your position, what you say you want in negotiation. It's independence. But what are your interests? In other words, why do you want independence? And there was this dead silence. And suddenly I realized that, look, for 25 years, they'd been fighting, thousands of lives lost. Everyone knew what their position was, but where they weren't really sure what their interests were. In other words, what are the key priorities behind that position? And the reason I ask that, why it's so important in negotiation, to always begin with that question of why. What's behind the customer's position? What's behind the boss's position? In this particular case was because they might not be able to get their position, independence, but they might be able to advance their interests. In this case, their interests might be, I wanted to know, what were their interests? Was it economic? Did they want control over their economic resources? Was it cultural? Did they want to be able, the reason they wanted independence was they wanted to be able to use their own language in schools? Was it political? Did they want control over the legislature? Did they want to, was it recognition? Did they want a seat at the UN? Because once they could focus on their interests, then they could maybe think, okay, how can we use this negotiation to advance our interests, even if militarily, and militarily it looked like they might be fighting another 25 years, they weren't going to win. So the key question in negotiation is always to ask, negotiation is always about positions. The customer comes in with a certain price, they come in with a certain demand. But ask yourself that magical question, why? Why is it you want that? Because in the end, you may not be able to give them their position. They want the product now at this price next week, but you might be able to meet their interests. What you find every successful negotiator does in negotiation is they're always looking behind positions, your own position and the other side's position, for what are the underlying interests. In other words, what are the underlying needs or desires or concerns that motivate them, so that you can try and address those rather than just talk about positions and seeing if they'll give a little bit here or give a little bit there, which often goes nowhere.
You can see from that video how important the idea of advancement is in negotiation. So again, the mediator has this progress bar in mind. Is this moving us along? And you could hear very clearly in that video the notion that the progress won't happen when we stick to our positions. So as we are mediators listening for what is behind, or maybe even asking questions, you heard some very good questions there on the video about, let me understand the background of those interests. So this is something you might, by the way, do in stage 2, but you might do again in stage 4 when you start talking about the sort of what we're going to do as a result of identifying the issues. And so as you kind of sift through that dialogue and kind of get clarity about it, then you can, in your phrasing, identify the interests and then start losing the language of positions. Now, the next task that we want to talk about is this notion that we are going to invent options for mutual gain. And this is a very interesting idea to talk about. The first word I want to talk about first, and that is inventing. Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, cool, that's where I start thinking of ideas and I start adding them in. And that is not you doing the inventing. That is you facilitating their inventing. And this is something that I find to be kind of good news, bad news for those of you out there that are big problem solvers. So if you tend to have that personality characteristic where you like to solve problems, like that's kind of your thing, what I would say to you is this is a very, very important area to hold back if that's something that you like to do. So when you're thinking about problem solving, don't throw out ideas. Even if you see them not seeing great ideas, you have to be patient for that. So the other day I was training a mediator, and this mediator is very, very skilled, and he was really wanting them to see some better solutions. So he started to suggest some of those solutions. And I stopped him, and I just said, you need them to get to the place where they see those solutions. The problem was that this mediator saw that solution like in the first 5 minutes. Oh, I know exactly what they should do. And so he started to suggest that. And so this mediator, when we were doing the correction, said, I don't know why it's so important. If it's a great idea, it's a great idea. And what I said back to him was, it needs to be their idea because of the durability issue. And being neutral and being, facilitative and all the things that we've talked about. But you don't get the buy-in if you suggest it. And some of the process of individuals coming to those solutions is kind of the magic of the stage 4, getting that durability. And so as you kind of think about it, you want to be patient. Now, I have before in mediation spent 40 minutes waiting for disputants to come up with ideas that maybe I had already thought of. But the key was they found their way to it. And so it's not about like, oh, I have a secret idea and I'm waiting for you to get to my great idea. If they never had my idea, that would be fine too. But patience is very, very crucial here in order to allow for that movement to happen on the part of the disputants and for them to figure out what it is that they're doing. So when we invent options, remember, you're not inventing. And then when we talk about the idea of mutual gain, of course, that is our goal. And if we can get buy-in, meaning they invent the ideas and they figure out things that are good for both parties, you really have something that you've accomplished there in terms of mediation. So let's take a look at this next clip talking about the concept of the orange, something you might have seen in negotiation. Let's take a look and talk about that further.
Story of the orange. It's the famous negotiation story. And it goes like this. There's two sisters, two little girls, and they're in a kitchen, and there is an orange. And they both really want the orange, and they're fighting over the orange, and there's just one orange left, and they're going at it, and they're fighting. And their dad comes in and finds them fighting, asks them what's going on, and each of them's like, I want the orange, I want the orange. Each of them gives all these reasons why she should get the orange. The father doesn't find any of these reasons particularly compelling, and so does the fairest thing he can think of, which is take the orange and cut it in half, give half of the orange to each daughter. They go off with their orange halves. The next day, the father goes up to the first daughter and says to her, how did that go? And she says, oh, I see how you did was fair. I wanted the orange because I wanted to make orange juice. And because I only had half an orange, I could only make half a glass of orange juice. But what you did was fair, I get it. Then he goes up to the second daughter. He says, how does it go? How did it go? And she says, oh, it went well. I wanted the orange because I was making a cake, and the recipe called for the peel of the orange. And because I only had half the orange peel, I could only make half the cake. But, I see how what you did was fair. So you're laughing because you see what the mistake was, as I think everyone was. So what could he have done differently? Right, he could divide it up differently, and each daughter could have had they actually talked about it. So in terms of, one daughter could have had the whole peel, and one daughter could have had the whole pulp. In terms of positions and interests, it's a really simple idea. So the position is, I want the orange, but the underlying interest is, why do you want the orange? Oh, I want it so I can make cake. Oh, I want it so I can make juice. Once you look at the underlying interests, you can start to come up with these different solutions. So you can come up with ways to make things better off better for both parties. So if you think about it, at the beginning, there's just only so much goodness in the world, right? Like either one sister's going to get the cake, in which case the other sister's just not going to get any juice at all. Or you think, oh, you know, that sister will get the juice and the other sister won't get any cake, or it could be half and half, it could be 25-75. But this whole approach to negotiation is an approach where you imagine that we're dividing up a pie and the size of the pie is fixed, and we can't create any more value. But what we see in this is that if we talk, we can invent options for mutual gain. We can create an outcome where one daughter gets, in this case, all the juice, and a whole glass of juice, and the other daughter gets the whole cake. So by doing this, you can invent options for mutual gain. The metaphor that's used for that is often the idea of expanding the pie. So this is a really powerful and useful idea. But to do that, you have to look at the underlying interests. And the thing that I want to suggest is that very often, in lots and lots of situations in life, there are great solutions like this that are not obvious.
So as you can see in the video, there is kind of a crossover between this notion of interest and this mutual gain. And so that is a task that the mediator has to keep in mind. The idea that we pull people off of those positions, and then when we're constructing the interest, is there some overlap that will establish that mutual gain? Now, he talked about in the clip this idea of expanding the pie. And that is to actually suspend judgment in such a way that you might be able to help them see that they have more options than maybe they thought were available. And you can see that illustrated in the story that he told. There are two other tools that I would add to this conversation that are useful to the mediator. One is called a two-way commonality statement. And this is where we phrase it in such a way that we are bringing the parties together in terms of guiding the problem-solving process. So I might say something in a two-way commonality to say, is there a way that we can accomplish Joe's concern while also accommodating Mary's main concern? And you can see how I have like an interest-based phrasing, and then I'm also putting their concerns together, which is focusing on this mutual gain. The other tool that I might add here is one called a collective solicit. And that is to phrase it in such a way that we solicit this collective idea or this mutual gain in how we phrase it. So we might say, is there a way for us to accommodate both interests as we think about it? Or what solutions do you have in mind that might achieve all of the concerns that are on your list today? And we can use those phrases to sort of move the progress along. Now, the last element of tasks that we want to talk about is this idea of insisting on criteria. So let's take a look at this next clip that focuses on that.
By introducing new concepts. And one of the most important concepts that they've introduced in that regard is the concept of objective criteria. And what do we mean by objective criteria? Fisher and Ury suggest that in any negotiation you're having, you have, to some extent, there's a contest of wills between people. And whether it's a friendly contest of wills or not, whether it's a cooperative contest of wills or a competitive contest of wills, in the end, it's me trying to get something and the other person trying to get something. Sometimes these things collide, and there's often likely to be friction. And some of this friction has its source in the fact that I am making demands of you and you are making demands of me, and we just don't like that. This leads us into power struggles. And as Fisher and Ury say, power struggles are inefficient and ineffective, and they damage the relationship, and they don't really get us where we need to go. So Fisher and Ury introduced the notion of objective criteria as a way to eliminate some of that. What are objective criteria? Objective criteria, which in later versions of Getting to Yes, they've also referred to as standards and as legitimacy, are things that are external to the negotiation that affect how the negotiation should be concluded. I know this sounds a little amorphous, but I'll explain. These are things that have nothing to do with either me or the other party, but do radiate into the negotiation and affect on what should be done in the negotiation. This is usually the type of thing that you can clear up with one easy example. For example, if we're arguing over the price I will pay for a used car, I want to pay one price, the seller wants me to pay another price, there's a book value that might have some input into what price I actually pay in the end. The book value which was put together by some neutral body who has no interest in either me paying anything or the seller making anything, a totally neutral person, organization. The book is an objective criteria that we can both look to and say, well, what does that say? Another example is the law. The law wasn't decided by me, it wasn't decided by the other party. So if in some negotiation we're trying to figure out who should make one payment or another, this type of closing fee, that who will pay that type of government fee or a contract fee or whatever it is. And it might be that in some situation the law says that the seller pays that type of tax or that the buyer pays that type of fees. And in that case what we do is we talk about it, I say you pay it, he says I pay it, you pay it, and we say, oh wait, the law says that the buyer says it, pays it, so we can do that. The law is a very black and white thing, well, at least until you get lawyers involved, but it seems to be a very black and white thing. But standards or objective criteria aren't always that solid. For example, it might be that some things aren't law, but you say, well, we can't agree between us, let's look at market practice. What does the industry do in these situations? What do most people do in these situations? What's common practice? So there's another form of looking at these things. Now, it's important to stress that objective criteria can help out, but they're never going to absolutely decide for you. Because two things happen. One is a party can say, yeah, but the objective criteria doesn't apply here because X, Y, Z. In other words, one party can differentiate between our situation and the situation that the objective criteria was intended to govern. The second is that unless the objective criteria is law, and there's a policeman standing by, most objective criteria simply aren't that strong. So I can say, if someone says, so why are you asking so much for your car? The book value is less. I can say, fine, but I want to ask more. I want more than book. And there is nothing in the world that says that I cannot ask for more than book. You can decide not to pay it, but there's no reason that I can't ask it, aspire towards it, hope to get it, and get it. So objective criteria, they might have some effect, but they're not sledgehammers. Finally, there might be more than one objective criteria that pertains. Sometimes there's more than one book in industry. Like one form of valuation will give you this outcome, another form of evaluation will give you that outcome. So if you are arguing the price of a house with a seller, and the seller says, well, but we received an estimate, an external third-party neutral estimate, and the house is worth $200,000, and you say, well, I received an external third-party estimate and it's worth 180, then you have clashing standards or clashing objective criteria, so you haven't really found a way to decide it. However, there is a lot of value in bringing objective criteria in to support your position and your desires in a negotiation for a simple psychological reason, and that is this. Very often, when you're engaged in a negotiation, one of the reasons the other party isn't going to give you what you hope to get is because you've demanded it of them. And they don't want to give it to you. In other words, that just you requesting it or demanding it might have entrenched them into saying, no, don't want to. However, if we're able to create some sort of shift into that the conversation becomes, listen, buddy, it's not that I want you to give me a lower price. It's not me, it's not you on me and me demanding a lower price, but look at the book. So if the guy's looking at the book, then he's not looking at me anymore. And maybe some of that adversary kind of mindset which is holding agreement back might be set aside, and the seller might be more inclined to make a concession towards the book than to make a concession towards me. So at least for that psychological effect, it certainly makes sense to look for objective criteria that you can bring into a negotiation that support your position, and try to use them in a way that takes attention off you and onto the objective criteria.
So as you can see in that clip, there's really a strong connection between this idea of interests and positions, and then also the idea of criteria. What I like to think about in terms of criteria is using criteria in a mediation is sort of like having another third party enter the room. In other words, this third party gives us fair market value or pricing or whatever standards that we might require on the type of dispute that we're managing. And so when we think about that, we're offering this third party as, and I'm not saying you offer it, but you could ask this question like, how did you determine fair market value? Or what do you believe is reasonable? Or where did you get to that idea? And when you they tell you that they consulted this outside source, then you can talk about that. And then all of a sudden you saw some of the benefits of moving people off of positions can really happen by introducing another third party besides yourself. So that's kind of an interesting strategy to think about in terms of problem solving and negotiation. Let's also take a look at this next clip where they give some additional tips for this stage.
It's not just the substantive issues that you're dealing with, but also the relationship itself that is part of what's being mediated. You can have people come to a mediation and you can resolve all the substantive issues that they are facing, and then they can leave the mediation and feel very disappointed if you have not helped them think about that relationship. People come to mediation in all different sort of ways, and sometimes the relationship is the crux of the matter. Sometimes they do just want a deal, and that is one of the challenges of mediation, is you don't know what people want. I do know that there's a tendency to not give enough attention to the relationship. The mix of detachment and personal investment, which is just a really interesting balance, and I think every mediator has to work that out for themselves. I think that mediators need to just be really limber with their ability to move into an analytical kind of view of what's going on, and also a sort of more almost spiritual, emotional presence with what's happening between the parties.
I think mediation, I've never been through it before, and I think that it was really helpful because it took some of the dynamic off of Jean and I and allowed us to just focus on somebody else who was able to kind of orchestrate us through this whole process, because when we would try to work it out together, we would argue or get upset or not really make any progress. And so I think working with Andrew and the whole mediation process helped us to define what we really wanted out of this, and then to find out what common ground we had, and when we didn't have common ground, to come up with some solution that would work. I think the mediation process has just quickly resolved an issue that is life and death for me, and because this is going to work out, I will be able to move on with my life.
You can see in the clip where the mediator is speaking that he talks about this notion of being limber. And I love this idea because I think it breaks us out of some of the traditional learning practices that you and I have possibly become acquainted with or even rely upon. This notion that everything just goes in a linear order, or that things are always one way or only the other way. The idea of being limber is this notion that the demands on the mediator are multifaceted, and that each of us needs to find his or her own style. And so as you're thinking about yourself as a mediator, especially in stage 4, the idea of being limber is so crucial because it means expanding options. It means asking questions that identify interests. It means looking for areas of mutual gain through strategic phrasing. It means really facilitating a creative process that's bigger than anyone in the room. And so as you think about your role as a mediator, I think limber is a very good way to think about that. Now, as we talk about the stage 4, one of the clarifications that I've talked about is understanding your role. And I have a little phrase that I like to think about in this stage, which is the disputants own the outcomes, the mediator owns the process. And as you think about those two notions together, just think about the outcomes, right? They belong to the disputants, and so they have to always belong to the disputants, but you own the process. And so anytime when you're needing to direct something, that is where you insert yourself as a mediator. You are the facilitator. You are the person making the choices about question asking and what we'll do to take a break and what we'll do when we come back from that break, and whether you caucus and talk privately with those people. So as you think about all of those decisions, of course, you're going to be very, very involved in all of those for the good of the mediation session, especially as we generate options and negotiate those options in stage 4. Now, this next clip talks about that notion a little bit more.
After the mediator has completed a side session, an exploratory side session, there could be more than one of these sessions in a mediator, depending upon the circumstances. The next phase of the mediation is what we call the option generation stage. At this stage, the mediator will encourage the parties, independently of one another usually, to find as many possible solutions to their dispute as they can. The idea is not to limit these options to one or two, but in fact to encourage parties to find as many options as they can. Doing this individually of one another enables each of them to apply their minds to solutions that they find more preferable to others, perhaps to rank them in some way, so that ultimately one can see whether it's possible to match these solutions. This is not something that ever happens in litigation, and that mediation is ideally suited for. During the option generation stage, a skillful mediator will help parties to generate options which they believe are their own solutions to the problem. Because again, bear in mind, it is not the function of the mediator to prescribe a solution to the party's dispute. The solution belongs to them. The mediator only owns the process.
So you can see Alan Nelson talking about this notion that the individuals need to do all of that work. Now, something I'm asked all the time is, what do you do if they don't come up with any solutions? And I've certainly been asked that in actual mediations in court, where someone will say, you just decide for us, or what do you think we should do? And you as a mediator need to be very, very careful about stepping into a role where you might accidentally say an idea. Certainly mistakes happen, so you have to just forgive yourself and move on. But just really guard that temptation of adding yourself into the process and thinking, oh, I have an idea, or here's something I want to add. Let them do it. Again, we return to the notion of patience. Let's take a look now at Alan Nelson in action, taking these same ideas, but actually doing it in a sample mediation.
Dr. Stanfield, thank you. During the adjournment, I asked you to give some thought to how you felt this matter could be resolved. Did you manage to come up with any ideas?
I've had a long think about it, and I think probably the easiest of the lot is if both of us just decide that this was just a bad experience. I don't really want to sue him. I don't know if he really wants to sue me. I just give him the whole business back. He can have his machines, he can have his leased property, etc. Just let me get out. And I think he probably might want to get out as well.
So if I understand you correctly, that would mean that the lease is cancelled.
Yep.
And that you don't sue him, and he withdraws his action against you.
Walk away from one.
And you give him the business back, as it were.
I would be more than happy to do that, because this has just been the wrong thing for me.
Okay. Any other options?
You know, I've put a lot of time and a lot of effort into getting this up, running. Financially, I thought that was running fairly well. Maybe I've been wrong. I've enjoyed what I've done. It's part of my vision. I'm just very bruised at the way it's all come out, but maybe the whole thing is designed to fail, in that the rentals are so high, the machine financing costs are so high, that maybe if we just became a bit more realistic and dropped that rental and extended the amount of time before which Clive would want to return on investment, maybe it might work.
So the two alternatives that you have in mind, the one would mean terminating the business, the other would mean proceeding with it more or less as you're doing at the moment, just at different rates.
Yes.
Are there any other options that you could think of?
Maybe Clive might want to have a closer look at the books, because I haven't been that prudent in watching the books. I thought Sue was pretty good at it,
Yeah.
but I'm open to an audit. In fact, we have to have an audit in the next 2 months anyway.
Okay, you mentioned that he is a good businessman.
Yep.
I do want to tell you that I did communicate your concerns to him, that you mandated me to tell him,
Mhm.
you know, about how this made you feel,
Yeah,
and that you
not sleeping,
You know,
yeah.
I've communicated all that to him, and he has mandated me to tell you that he feels you are a good man.
Oh, that's actually quite
yeah,
nice.
he wanted me to tell you that. But he also has asked me to communicate to you that the accusations that you have levelled against him about dishonesty, he feels very, very hurt by, and he has asked me to canvass with you the possibility of your perhaps apologising to him. Before you answer that question, what I'd like to ask you is, have you given any consideration to perhaps looking at Clive and you working a bit closer going forward? Is this something that you would not be prepared to do, or is it something you'd be prepared to consider?
Let's look at first things first. I was inflamed when I accused him of being dishonest. I admit that.
Okay. Well, that's very big of you, I must say.
I was also very upset and hurt the way that he just went and issued summons. But two wrongs don't make a right, so I'd look at maybe retracting from what I'd said there.
Okay. Well, I think that's very good of you. That's. I think that'll mean a lot to Clive, and
Yeah,
I
it
think
was
that'll go a
maybe
long way
said
to
in haste,
restoring
but
your relationship.
Yeah, I just was cross.
Okay. So having said that, as I say, I think that's going to go a long way to restoring your relationship. But given your qualities and the fact that Clive can't run this business without you, and given Clive's qualities, it seems to me that there might be some sense in the two of you trying to look at working a little more closely than you have in the past going forward. How would that make you feel?
I think if we can look at fixing our relationship, which was rocky or is rocky, there's nothing wrong with the machinery. There's nothing wrong with the passion that I have to fix young athletes, and the outcomes were pretty good. I don't have bookkeeping skills, and I've trusted Sue. But if Clive thinks he can maybe do a better job, I'd look at it. Yeah?
Now, Clive's also mandated me to communicate to you that he has a real problem with Sue, and that
Sue?
yeah, and that a relationship going forward with you would require that Sue be excluded from the picture. How does that make you feel?
Is this not just sour grapes because he had a relationship with her?
I think you must make your own conclusions as far as that is concerned. I really can't go there, but it seems to me that Clive has a very good, positive feeling about you. You are prepared to apologise for what seems to have been said in a heated moment. And as I've said, you both have qualities that I think would go very well together in making this business a success. If Sue is the only thing that's in the way of achieving that, what would your feeling be about saying, okay, let's exclude her from our future plans, if I can put it that way?
I'm just thinking from Sue's point of view. She's stood by me. She's helped me in the business. Clive hasn't. If we're looking at the bigger picture, and if she's the only piece that doesn't fit in this jigsaw puzzle, then we have to make it worth her while. One's going to actually be fair to her in terms of basic conditions, etc. Pay her out, maybe give her a little bit more than that. I'm not I don't have any personal interest in Sue.
I see.
I have a passion for sports medicine. And if by Clive and myself getting together and doing this with, in this time, a very clear agreement that is analysed by my attorneys and by his, because I have been burnt once, I'd consider that.
You would, okay. And can you see this business perhaps growing to new levels?
I've only got one machine. We've got millions of athletes. That was my passion.
Clive's financial position, would he be able to inject more capital into this and perhaps grow your dream and your passion as well?
I don't know. I mean, I'd be quite happy if he would volunteer to do that, but I'm not privy to his finances.
Would you mandate me to put the 3 proposals or the 3 options on the table that we've now discussed?
Mm-hmm.
One option being giving him the business back.
Yep.
The second is a reduced rental and payoff terms. And the third is going forward, perhaps the two of you working together more closely and running this as a joint venture, perhaps of some kind.
Go with that.
And sorting out the problem with Sue. You happy to meet with that?
I'm quite happy to hear what he has to say.
I think at this point it would be useful if I meet with Clive for a short session, and I put these proposals to him. And if I believe that it's appropriate, then I'm going to put the two of you together so that you can see whether you can't reach consensus on this matter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seinfeld.
Good.
As you can see in this example, the mediator is skilled at giving the workload back to the disputant. And this is something that I would really caution you about as a mediator. If you feel at any time that you are too burdened, usually it's indicative of the idea that you are doing too much of the work. And so good mediators or skilled mediators will give that workload back to the disputants. And that's a very important notion to keep in mind at every stage. Now, one thing you noticed about this example is it was done in the caucus format. And that, of course, is a unique format where we talk to people one-on-one. I don't recommend using too much of this format when it's not necessary. So, of course, your decision whether to use caucusing or not depends on what you're trying to achieve. What I like to say is use a caucus when you are not able to get the same amount of progress in a joint session. The reason I favor joint sessions whenever possible, and I understand there's times when we can't do that, but I favor joint sessions for the sheer elaboration that both parties are able to engage in together. And so what does that mean? That means that when I hear this other party talking about their thoughts and feelings, I actually am considering their point of view more than if I just go in a separate room the whole time. Now, sometimes in civil harassment court, for example, I know I have to shuttle the whole time, but it is more work because we have to keep working on showing those different points of view to both parties, and we have to facilitate that, and it just takes probably twice as much time, I would say. So you saw this is done in a caucus format. The other thing that you noticed is that this mediator uses more evaluative terms than I am comfortable with. And some of you have heard me talk about this topic already. He says, like, that's a good thing to do, or that was good of you, I think is the quotation that he used in the mediation. And I understand that this is to facilitate progress, but I would be very, very cautious about using evaluative terms because they can demonstrate sidedness, and then they also can demonstrate or complicate the interaction in that the disputant is trying to maybe please you. So maybe if you don't say that's good or that's a good idea, they might question whether they have to get your approval. And you don't want to be put in the role of being the approver. You want to be in the role of facilitating their own decision for their benefit. Again, we return to the most important part of the process, and that is I control the processes of the mediator, the disputants control the outcomes. Now, one area we haven't talked about yet is this notion of fear. And this really comes up in different formats of mediation as we talk about these. The example that I'm going to show you in a second is one from divorce mediation, and it's where fear interrupts or becomes sort of the enemy of the problem solving. Let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Roseanne Vanella of Advanced Mediation Solutions, a family mediation firm in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And today I thought that I would do a video blog. And my guest today is Joanna Kleinman, psychotherapist of the Center for Extraordinary Relationships, also in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Joanna, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Joanna, what I want to discuss today is fear.
Yes.
So many people who call me to come in for the initial consult are really going through such a period of turmoil in their lives.
Yes.
They're going through a divorce. They're uncertain about what their future is going to bring. They're uncertain about their children. I get it. I feel for them.
Right.
I've been there.
Yes.
I've been through a divorce.
Sure.
So today what I'd like to do is have you as a psychotherapist
Yeah.
explain
Yes.
where this fear is coming from.
Right.
And then what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how I work with my clients to help them through the process of mediation and what it really does for them and how it kind of puts the fear at ease.
Yeah. Yep. So one of the things that I focus in on, you know, I've seen thousands of people in my professional career, okay? And the thing that causes most of the suffering that we all experience is this voice in our minds. It's automatic. And when we are afraid, okay, about how something's going to go, what's going to happen in the future, how are things going to be,
The unknown.
Absolutely.
It's really when we're afraid when we don't know what's going to happen, when we've never been through the experience.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, it's actually in our DNA, okay? We forget that we are animals, right?
Right.
So in our DNA, we have this, you know, it's sort of from our primitive brain that has us sense out danger, okay? But the problem is, in our lives now, okay, we're not running from tigers who are chasing us, you know, where we're going to be dinner, right? So what we're really running from is what I call really psychological tigers, right? So where our mind automatically goes is the mind paints these worst case scenarios, right? About what's going to happen or how's it going to be or how's it going to go.
Right, so we're always imagining the absolute worst that'll happen to us.
And we're not even aware of it.
Right.
We're not even aware that we're doing that. And then what happens is physiologically and psychologically, we're reacting as though that worst case scenario that our minds have created is actually occurring right now. And it's not.
Right, that it's the actual reality. When it's not.
It's not.
So what I always tell couples when they come to me and I start working with them through the mediation process is that, you know, there's a process that I go through and there's a reason that I go through the process. It's literally step by step.
Yeah.
So the last thing I want are for my clients to get overwhelmed, to hang on to this fear, because I don't want them making decisions based upon fear.
It's debilitating.
Exactly.
Right? Keeps you up at night. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in divorce, there's this very specific process that we go through, and I can quickly just tell you what my process is that if there are children involved, we take care of the kids first. We create a parenting plan.
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
I've yet to meet two parents that don't want the best for their children.
Of course. Of course.
After that, we discuss the financial issues, spousal support, child support, and then we get to the equitable distribution.
Yes.
So separating out all of the debts, the assets, but I very quickly went through it here. We're going through this in a process of weeks and a couple of months. So it's kind of like clients who come to me eventually, I think, move beyond that fear.
Yes.
That they understand it'll be okay.
Yeah.
I always talk to them about, you know, different case scenarios that can go on, and we look at absolutely everything that might happen, so we address that in case there's something that goes on.
So great.
So, yeah.
You know, because I'm a couples therapist, right?
Okay.
So the thing that I always say, you know, because, I mean, listen, not every marriage, you know, survives.
50%.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, you know, I definitely have, you know, some clients that come for couples counseling and they decide to separate or divorce. But what I always tell them is that, you know, particularly when you have children, you're going to be in some sort of relationship for the rest of your lives.
Yeah.
So this is why it's so great that they come to you, because you're guiding them through the process in such a way that they can maintain that relationship, that is so important for the well-being of the children.
And it's different. The relationship changes. Like I always tell them, you're no longer going to be mom and dad, but you're going to be in the business of raising your children.
That's right.
And also, most importantly, it teaches them to negotiate with each other.
Yes.
Which most couples, when you're together, there really isn't a lot of negotiation.
Yeah.
It usually goes one way or the other.
Yes, yes.
So,
Yep.
yes. But Joanna, thanks so much for explaining that. I
Yes.
thought it was best to have a professional here to talk about it.
Right.
And I hope that we'll be able to do some things in the future, too. For
Absolutely.
my
I
clients.
would love it. Yep.
Thank
that
you.
sounds great.
So as we think about this clip, one of the ideas I had behind showing you that clip is to talk about the structure of the mediation being the remedy for fear. And I want you to think about those together. So sometimes fears become very unorganized, right? They become very compelling. And so what you can offer as a mediator is a way to, in your phrasing, in your facilitating, to offer some structure to get a handle on those intense emotions. And so as we think about this, we can think about even it comes down to the phrasing that you and I are doing. And so when I'm phrasing something to someone who might have some fear, I might say, let's look at what possible solutions are out there to satisfy both of you. Because one party might say, oh, I'm afraid I won't get mine, or I'm afraid I won't get my deal. And you can phrase things in such a way that we want everyone to be satisfied. Once in a while, I'll have a disputant say something like that in a mediation to say, hey, you're not listening to me, or you're not thinking about what I'm going to get. I'm going to get nothing here. And I will stop them and say, I want to make sure you are totally satisfied with the outcome. And that's why we want to do it in an organized way. So as you're thinking about structure, think about it as the solution to the presence of fear. And you heard even that mediator talking about that notion. We have one more clip to look at, and that's Chris Moore talking about transformative mediation and also the deal that is the outcome.
So would it be fair to say that you have some concerns for people who are seeking the relationship transformation, and that may eclipse and overshadow doing quality work?
I think I have, it's interesting, I feel like I stand in the middle. The paradigm that has been put forth, which I think is, frankly, it's a false paradigm, is between the problem solver versus the transformative mediator. Right. I believe that the good mediator is basically doing both. The difference, I think, is I have as much concern about the deal maker, mediator, who is cutting a substantive deal, which may be the mediator's deal as opposed to the parties, as I do about the transformative mediator who has such a heavy agenda that I'm trying to change the moral view of the way that you look at the world.
Right.
And I'm not sure that we as intermediaries either have a right or should do that. And I'm not also sure about how long those kinds of agreements really hold unless it's really the parties' agreement.
So you can see Chris Moore talks about this notion that this deal that you end up with after doing all of the idea generation and getting to some solutions that people want to jointly agree upon, you can see Chris Moore talking about this notion that it needs to not be the mediator's deal. And that is kind of an easy way for us to say, again, the same thing we've been talking about the whole show is this notion that you cannot insert yourself at any part of this. So we just think about that and then also think about that notion related to durability, that when they own the outcomes and when they are owning the solutions and deciding on them for their mutual gain, you have a much higher shot at durability. Now, the last section of the show we have done before, which is where I answer questions that you've posted either on our online format or have asked me personally about mediation. So I'm going to take a few of those to wrap up the show. So let's talk about the first one, which is if someone is angry or crying, what should the mediator do? And my comment about that, we've talked about this a little bit, is that it depends on the context. So sometimes there is a way for you as a mediator to ask what's going on. And you have to do this in like the nicest way possible because you don't want to minimize or accelerate the emotional response. So sometimes I might say, if a disputant starts crying, I might say, so tell me what's going on. Or I might say, tell me what's changed that is something that you're reacting to now. Part of the challenge of emotional management is to have a few phrases available so that when you encounter that, you're ready for it. Sometimes I'll have people who maybe stand up in a mediation, or I've had people pound on the table, like in anger, or point fingers at me, and maybe start yelling. And I will ask them, I'll say, so a minute ago we were just sitting and now I see that you're upset. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what changed. Tell me what's on your mind. And I might ask that, but again, I would return to context to say, when we're thinking about this, think about what works in the context where you are, because sometimes you can't actually hold space for it as much as you might in one context as much as you might in another. So of course you're going to have to base what you do there as a mediator. But what would I recommend? I would recommend acknowledging emotion that appears to be a component. And I would also have phrasing available for the management of that emotion rather than just pretending it didn't exist. Or as many of my new mediators do, they call a caucus anytime there's an emotional expression. And I would say that's a bad idea because usually it's useful information. As you've heard me say before, it means we're getting to the bottom of things. And so when we see an emotional reaction, we find that we're near an issue or multiple issues. One of the next questions is, do you stop and read contracts in mediation? And my answer would say, again, would be context matters. So sometimes when you have a planned mediation, like in your private practice, for example, you might have the contracts forwarded to you already before you start the mediation. So yes, I would say stop and read those if you have the chance to do that. But sometimes, and frequently, honestly, in court, I see people whip out contracts and they will hand them to me and say, here, this explains everything. And so what I will do is use a typical phrase of me as a mediator, and you have to find your own style on this, but I'll say, tell me what I need to know that's in this contract that you would point out as important. And what am I doing? I'm giving them the work back again, and I'm having them highlight what they believe is pertinent information. The other thing I'm going to do is if somebody hands me a contract, for example, and they say, see, look at this, I'm going to make sure that both parties have had a chance to look at it. So I'm going to say, have you seen this? And I'll say, and have you seen this? Right? And make sure anytime anything's introduced that both parties have seen what it is we're talking about. And so just be aware that you want to handle it that way as well. Okay, what about binders? And this is something that happens sometimes in landlord-tenant disputes, and I've talked about this a little bit. It came up again. What do you do when people have just tons of information that they're bringing to the mediation? Again, same strategy. I'm going to say to them, tell me what, if I read every page of the binder, if I looked at every picture, if I looked at every drawing, what would I conclude? And again, it would be a way to shortcut some of the workload and then also focus on what it is that is their concern. Now, sometimes you go through the binders, of course, but again, now you have to make sure you understand your role. I have seen mediators forget their role as mediators and become judge. And judges look at evidence and proof, and that is not what you're doing. So just be very clear on your role. When you're looking at evidence, it is not to try to prove right or wrong. It is only to understand the case better. And so you can hear my phrasing is really about going after those underlying interests as opposed to proving who did it or who didn't do it or who is right or who is wrong. Now, on the opposite side, we have what happens when people don't bring important information. Okay, this happens all the time in court. And they'll say to me, do you mind if I just run back home and get my contract? Or do you mind if I just go out to my car, or I go over to the county and get the survey? And yes, I do mind, actually. You can't leave. And we'll say, as a phrase that mediators will say, like, today is the day, like we're in the actual session right now. What do you want to do? That's the same in court. The judge won't say, oh, you can go get that piece of information. And so when we're in court mediation, I would say we don't really go get additional information. I know some people look things up on their phone, and that's going to be your judgment call in terms of context. Sometimes I've seen the judge allow something like that, but mostly if they don't have it, then it's just really not part of the mediation. The only thing I would add, though, is sometimes people don't disagree on what the contract said or what the lease agreement said. So I've had parties before where they are roommates and they're dissolving their roommate relationship and their security deposits or whatever it is they're suing each other for, and will I'll say, do you have a lease agreement? And they say no. And I'll say, what is in the lease agreement? And then they'll agree on it, basically meaning that we didn't need the document at all. And so that's kind of, I guess, ask questions and understand the context or the importance of that. One other question that I get a lot is, what do you do with minutia? What do you do with small, unimportant information? And my answer would be to leave it on the floor. You've heard me talk about the notion of picking up ideas that they put out on the table, right? And we've talked about the Lego example and different ways we put things together. There are many parts of mediation. There are some parts, I guess it depends on the mediation, where people will introduce ideas that's very unimportant, just unimportant information. Or they'll give you other information that is just absolutely not necessary. Like they'll say, well, that day was a Thursday, and on Thursdays I always have my coffee first, and then I go to the gym, and then they tell you about their landlord-tenant issue. And my comment would be, there's no reason to ask about the minutia. There's no reason to pursue any line of questioning. Just leave it on the floor, meaning don't pick it up and examine it. Just let it happen. And sometimes you need to focus people and say, well, tell me what are the most important ideas. Or tell me what was the event that brought you here. And sometimes doing that will get out of the minutia. You can see in those two examples, I've asked individuals to identify like a bigger issue as opposed to saying, tell me about the small details. And that a little bit is your decision as a mediator in context to say that when I'm mediating, I have all these possible areas that I can ask about, and you're going to have to be just using your intuition. And you might be wrong sometimes. You might ask about something that's unimportant, and then you might also focus on big issues. So just realize the phrasing that's important there, and that's the notion that you say things like, well, tell me what are the big issues that stand out to you. Tell me what do you think are the key stumbling blocks. Tell me what are the things that are making you angry about the situation. Tell me what brought us here. I use that example. All of those phrases to identify bigger issues and let go of the small details. Now, this next one was about the interview that I did with Julia Chavez, and it was about the discrimination that we were talking about in the interview, saying how was she discriminated against, and then what do you do about that issue? So we talked about two areas that she's been discriminated against in court. One is for being younger, and the other is for being a Latina. And one of the things that she talked about with me, and I'm not sure how it got edited in its final version, I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I just wanted to go back over this with you. She talked about being with co-mediators, and sometimes individuals would direct their attention to the co-mediator or only answer questions the co-mediator asked, not answering Julia's questions. And that, or saying, well, you wouldn't understand. Or maybe you don't know about this situation, or maybe you're unfamiliar with it. Any kind of phrasing or questioning that is indicating sort of that lack of trust as a mediator. So the question is, what do you do about it? And we had talked a little bit about this in the interview, saying, what do you do about when someone dismisses you for being younger or for being older or for being a certain ethnic background? And the answer I would say is, one, know your role, which I've talked about a lot today. And two, understand your context. So when I look at mediation, I think, gosh, I'm helping you get to a better place than when you walked in here. And so as I think about that process, I might hear you discriminate against me because I'm female, or I might have you discriminate because you believe I'm younger or inexperienced or whatever the reason. And I can sort of disassociate my personal feelings with being maybe offended by that and say, regardless of what point of view you have, I'm going to focus on my role of helping you. And so you heard Julia saying, oh, well, she learned a lot from the co-mediator, getting all this attention from the disputants. And she realizes also she can't solve the issue of ageism, sexism, ethnic discrimination, whatever. We're not there to kind of right that wrong. Now, I am not saying that this is fine for people to discriminate or to be judgmental or rude or any of those things. I don't condone those behaviors. But if you're very clear about your role and you're very clear about what it is you can and cannot achieve in a mediation, then you're able to kind of get the most out of it, I guess is the perspective that I would take. And that role clarification is what really gets you that, combined with the understanding of the context. What we're doing is trying to help you get to a better place. That's the context that we're in. Okay. Another question that I get a lot is, what do you do when you're stuck? So I'll find that mediators will roll along, and then they'll get sometimes to a place where they are not sure what to do next. And it's sort of like a freeze. Now, one comment I would make is silence is fine. So it's okay if you're stuck to have it be silent. The other comment that I would make is I would go from the interaction level to the meta level when you're stuck. And what do I mean by that? We've talked about this before. The interaction level is the level that you and I use to engage upon in our conversation. The meta communication level is when we talk about what's going on in the communication. So when we see a breakdown on this interaction level, what I would suggest is that we move to the meta level and narrate that stuckness. Okay, so you hear me say, if I was coaching you, to narrate where you're stuck. And what do I mean by that? You can say, gosh, we have been moving along progressively in this interaction the following way. So you're talking about what's happening in the interaction level. And then as I'm seeing it now, we seem like we're at a sticking point. And I would, again, give them back the workload right there and say, so what do you want to do to move us forward? It would be tempting for you to take that responsibility. Very, very tempting. And I've seen many mediators try to do that, where they're like, I've got to think of something, they'll say to themselves, or I've got to give a solution, or I've got to solve this problem. You do not need to do any of those things. What you do is say, I see that at this point we are no longer making progress. So I want to maybe take a caucus, establish a caucus, or I maybe want to ask a couple other questions to move us. And so that's what I would challenge all of us to think simultaneously. On the interaction level, are we engaging productively? And then from a meta communication standpoint, can I see that progress happening, or do I need to narrate a little bit of that progress in order to get us to move on the interaction level? Okay, so one thing that came up the other day in court is there was a mediator in court who was talking with one of my student interns, and this mediator said that I want to share with you my perspective about mediation. And so my student shared this with me, and this mediator said, I basically like to put my disputants into three places to get them to solve problems. I want to exaggerate their fear, their uncertainty, and their doubt. And my student intern called me up and said, is it possible to mediate from fear, uncertainty, and doubt? And my comment would be that that is really misunderstanding the process of mediation. When we think about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, we know they have that. I do not need to exaggerate it to get somebody to get to a solution. So part of what I heard in that perspective is really, I'm going to play with people's emotions in order to get them to get to a solution. And that is precisely what I would caution you never to do. I would say that that kind of is a way to get out of your own workload, right? If I try to stir up fear in you, I don't have to do as much, right? And so what I would say is no. I would suggest exactly the opposite, that we would combat fear with structure, that we would combat uncertainty with elaboration, that we would not have doubt because we're talking through all of the issues. And so that as we think about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, those would be things that we would actually fight against so that we could help them get to a better place. Certainly, this is something they might struggle with outside of the mediation, but something that shouldn't be present in our process. Okay, and then the last one is, what about attire? What should you wear to a mediation? And so one of the comments that I would make is one that I talk about a lot with my student interns, and that is, I suggest that you have invisible attire. Now, you might laugh at that and say, that is really an interesting suggestion. Let me tell you what I mean by that phrase. When I talk about invisible attire, what I'm saying is that your attire should be so appropriate to the context that you don't notice it. In other words, the clothes that you're wearing don't distract us and become noticeable as a component of the mediation. So if you're in a casual setting, I would suggest that you dress casually. If you're in a court setting, we see a lot of people in suits and ties, right? And so the attire becomes invisible in the sense that people are not noticing it because it's so appropriate to the context. I would also suggest this is the same concept we would use in terms of nonverbal expression. That when we think about nonverbals, we're looking for what I would call invisible delivery. In other words, your delivery is so compelling and good that I don't necessarily notice the delivery that you're engaging in, because I'm able to hear the words you're saying. So that is where we kind of interface with the context, and we become very good students of what our task is, what our role is, and what context we're operating in. So today we've talked about the stage 4 components. We've talked about some goals. We've talked about some tasks that the mediator does. And I would challenge each of you to really think through all of that. And then as we become better and practice those skills, we can become better at mediation. That's all we have today. Have a great day.